What's up, people, and welcome back to Religion Camp. My name is Mark Gagnon, and thank you for joining me in my tent, where every single week we explore the most interesting, fascinating, controversial stories from every religion from around the world, ever and always. As always, I'm joined by my dear friend Christos. How are you, my friend?
Doing great.
All right, Christos, it's too much yapping. We're getting tons of comments, and people are unsubscribing in droves, all right? We don't have time. You're trying to stop these people from learning about the Buddha. If you've never heard of the Buddha, strap in. We're going to go through everything. Probably one of history's most fascinating and arguably misunderstood figures in religious history. Now, you've probably seen those smiling, chubby, fat Buddhas, right? You've seen them. There's the fat Buddha, there's the skinny Buddha. They're all the Buddha, okay? Well, actually, they're two different people. So we'll explain that later. But today, we're not talking about the fat one. We're talking about the actual Buddha. We're going to explore the real story of Siddhartha, the prince who gave up everything to basically find the solution to human suffering. So, who was the Buddha? I'm sure you probably, like I said, seen these fat, chubby guys. And not to fat shame, but, this guy is he's gifted, He's blessed, as they say in the South. He's not fat. He's big-boned. Regardless, this cheerful Buddha matches how a lot of people think about Buddhism, right? This is a religion that's focused on calmness and joy and just stuff in your face with McDonald's. However, it turns out that the well-known grinning fat Buddha isn't the real Buddha at all. That's not the Buddha that we're talking about, not Siddhartha, right? This happy character represents a Chinese religious man from around 1,000 years ago who some Chinese followers of Buddhism believed was potentially a form of a Buddha who will come in the future. But the person that you see isn't typically the Buddha that we discussed. The Buddha we are focusing on today is called Siddhartha, a spiritual guide who existed in areas that are now northern India and southern Nepal around 2,500 years ago. And the lessons he shared eventually developed into a religion that we now call Buddhism, which some people, might interpret it not as a religion, but rather a philosophy, just a way of life, a way to frame your existence, whereas religion typically is encumbered with, dogma and rules, which many Buddhists that I've spoken to don't necessarily see their worldview as, being strict and rigid. You probably come across the familiar tale of Siddhartha, especially as shown in films like The Little Buddha with Keanu Reeves, shout out to him. The tale describes a rich young prince who lived a protected life until he basically went out of his palace and saw disease and death and all this terrible stuff. And this discovery of how reality actually is upset him so much that he abandoned his comfortable rural existence to do the very simple task of finding a solution to all human pain and misery. Pretty easy, right? And fortunately for us, after years of searching, he actually achieved a spiritual understanding that earned him the title of Buddha. He then dedicated the remainder of his life to helping others find an end to their suffering, or at least learn to cope with it better. What's up, people? Let's take a break really quick because I want to talk to the fellas. Let me ask you something. Are you stuck? Do you feel like you're struggling with work or relationships or maybe your marriage, or just feeling like you're not like the dude you want to be? You ever just, thinking to yourself like, man, I should be farther along right now. I just get caught in these cycles where I just kind of lose self-control. Well, here's the thing that nobody likes to admit. It is possible that porn might be part of the problem. Now, yes, I know, I said the P word. Now, look, I don't want to be overly moralistic here, okay? But if you're someone that struggles with pornography and, research has shown that regular porn users actually leaves men feeling more anxious and less connected and ironically less satisfied. And then it creates a cycle that then you got to be a little secretive about. And you tell yourself like, oh, I'll quit. And then you come back to the same cycle and now you're in a trap. Well, that's where Relay comes in. Relay is a therapist-backed app with actual clinicians designed to help men quit pornography and actually feel better and get control of their lives. And the difference with Relay is that you're not doing it alone. With Relay, you basically join a small group of guys that are kind of on the same road. They're sharing accountability and encouragement and actual tools to help when triggers hit and you're feeling, anxious or alone. Relay helps you feel a little more connected. And you can stay totally anonymous, but for the first time, you're not going to be in this battle alone. I mean, think of it like a gym membership, but with your brain and for your habits and for the future of your relationship maybe, right? Thousands of men and their families are already seeing some change because the men in their lives are a little bit less stuck. So if you're feeling stuck, check out Relay. Don't wait another month to be the man that you want to be today. And you can break the cycle with Relay. So go ahead and use the code GAGNON, Gagnon, for a 7-day free trial if you feel like this thing has just got a grip on you that you're not able to let go. That is Join Relay, Join, Relay, RELAY.app, app/camp, and use the code GAGNON for a 7-day free trial. Don't put it off. Be the man you're supposed to be today. Now let's get back to the show. But before we go further, let me pose what may sound like an unusual question. Exactly when did the Buddha's existence begin? Right? We could answer that it started 2,500 years ago, like I just said, when he was born into a physical body that would later become enlightened, at least according to Buddhist beliefs. Yet, Buddhists hold unique views about how reality operates, making the answer a lot more complicated than just being like, oh, it was on his birthday. So throughout this conversation, we will examine how Buddhists generally understand the Buddha and Buddhas in general, right? His identity, his origins, and his actions, along with what researchers and historians think, and kind of how these two things come together. So if we want to grasp who the Buddha really is, we should begin examining the name itself. The word Buddha comes from an ancient language called Sanskrit. Many people still today will read Sanskrit, and it's spoken in some parts of the world as well, specifically the root word Bud, which means to wake up. This means that the Buddha actually translates to the awakened one, making it a pretty special title rather than someone's actual name that their parents give them. But this raises an important question. What are they waking up from? So to answer this, we need to explore how Buddhists picture the universe, which they show through a detailed diagram called the Bhava Chakra, or the Wheel of Life. And while the version we see today might be newer, these circular images have existed in Buddhist culture for centuries, and they hold a ton of meaning. The most important thing to know about this Wheel of Life is that it operates exactly like a spinning wheel. It keeps on turning forever and ever and ever and ever without stopping. And this happens because ancient Buddhas, along with many other people from South Asia, believe strongly in this concept of rebirth or reincarnation. This means that when someone dies, their story doesn't end. Instead, they get born again somewhere else in basically an endless cycle. They might come back as divine beings in heaven, or perhaps as creatures suffering in hell, or even as animals roaming the earth. And this process continues forever without any real exceptions. Even the powerful gods eventually die and then get reborn. And what makes this belief system unique is that Buddhists never thought some all-powerful creator God designed this cycle. In the way in many monotheistic religions, we believe that there is just one conscious God that put everything into existence. They believe it simply exists as a natural part of reality. While being reborn multiple times might sound exciting, most Buddhists throughout history saw it in a different light. They viewed this never-ending pattern of birth, pain, and death, and rebirth as something troubling that should be escaped. And they gave this painful cycle a specific name, samsara. Now, the Buddha represents someone who successfully broke free from samsara and the suffering that's attached to it by reaching a state called nirvana. Now, you probably heard Nirvana, right? Shout out Kurt Cobain. Not the band, the place, or basically the awakened enlightenment, this complete spiritual freedom. And once the Buddha achieved nirvana, he no longer had to experience the endless cycles of dying and being reborn. Additionally, the Buddha became a teacher who showed others how they could also escape from this cycle. So this brings us back to understanding why he's called the awakened one. The Buddha is someone who woke up to see reality as it truly is, while everyone else is stumbling through samsara, like people sleepwalking, unaware of what's actually happening around them. Now, the Buddha's awakening was unique for its focus on diagnosing and treating suffering. While many ascetic teachers sought power or immortality or purity, the Buddha taught 4 noble truths, as are described in Buddhist philosophy. That suffering exists, it has causes, it can be ended, and that the eightfold path is the practical method to achieving liberation, to actually escaping samsara and getting to nirvana. Another distinct feature of his teaching was that it emphasized personal verification. So the Buddha encouraged his followers to test his teachings in their own lives rather than just accepting them just because the Buddha said so, not appealing to his authority. And this attitude set him apart from many religious teachers of his time and many religious teachers even to this day, and contributed to Buddhism's longevity as well as its adaptability. Some modern theologians and sort of religious scholars will compare this idea to like a scientific approach to spirituality, appealing to people who value rational thought and actual practical lived experience, more than just an appeal to, the highest teacher. And while this analogy is not historical, it kind of helps explain why Buddhism continues to resonate with so many different cultures around the world. Actually, when we look at traditional Buddhist belief about the universe, we discover something really surprising. There have been numerous Buddhas throughout history. And while Buddhist teaching tells us that our Buddha is Siddhartha Gautama, they also explain that he represents just one figure in an extremely long series of enlightened teachers. Now, you might be wondering, okay, how does this actually work? Buddhist teaching describes time as moving in circles rather than a straight line, similar to that diagram that I showed earlier. This circular view suggests that existence has been continuing for an incredibly vast period, possibly even for endless amounts of time with no beginning and no end. Occasionally, throughout this enormous span of time, someone discovers the true nature of existence, becomes a Buddha, and shares with others the path towards this spiritual freedom. Sadly, after each Buddha appears, people slowly forget his lessons over many generations, and the world returns to a state of spiritual darkness. Eventually, when the time is right, another Buddha emerges to then teach again, thus the cycle continues. Do you remember the smiling figure that we were talking about before, who many people believe will be Buddha in the future? Each of these enlightened teachers share identical lessons, which Buddhists refer to as the Dharma. This happens because the basic nature of human suffering and the method to overcome it remains constant throughout time. Therefore, our Buddha never claimed he was presenting brand new ideas. Instead, he said he had simply rediscovered the same eternal truths that countless teachers before him and after him will also share. When we want to truly comprehend the Buddha's life story, according to the Buddhist tradition, we have to recognize that he represents one teacher among many in this endless chain of Buddhas, with each one sharing the same timeless wisdom. Since there have been many enlightened teachers throughout history, it raises another question. What process allows someone to actually become the Buddha? Could you be the Buddha? Listen to this right now. How exactly did our Buddha, Siddhartha, actually achieve this remarkable status? And Buddhist teaching explains that reaching Buddhahood requires an extremely lengthy journey of spiritual development and self-improvement that likely could span countless lifetimes, literally billions of lifetimes. And it all starts with making a sacred promise. Certain Buddhist traditions share this story. In ancient times, there lived an earlier Buddha called Dipankara. This wise teacher drew massive crowds of people that were eager to listen to him and learn his wisdom. And among those who attended his lesson was a man named Sumedha. One day, while Dipankara was traveling, Sumedha spotted a large, muddy puddle basically blocking Buddha's path. And wanting to prevent this revered teacher from ruining his clothes and getting his feet all dirty, Sumedha immediately threw himself down on the ground and used his own hair to cover the muddy water, creating a clean pathway for Dipankara to cross. When Dipankara witnessed this selfless act, he made a prophecy. He looked directly at Sumedha and declared, "One day, you will be born as Siddhartha and you will attain awakening and become a Buddha." Upon hearing these words, Sumedha made a commitment that he would indeed become a Buddha someday. And this sacred promise launched him on this spiritual adventure, basically, that would require him to slowly develop positive qualities and earn good karma through billions and billions of different lives before he could actually reach enlightenment. Buddhist culture preserves the memory of these countless previous existences through a special type of religious literature called the Jataka, or birth stories. These tales basically describe the Buddha's earlier incarnations before he reached his ultimate spiritual goal. And throughout this enormous period of preparation before actually achieving full awakening, and therefore not yet being a Buddha, he is called by the Sanskrit term bodhisattva. And I just want to apologize for my pronunciation. I don't speak Hindi or read Sanskrit, so I'm doing my best, okay? And basically this term just means someone whose entire existence, or sattva, is focused on reaching the enlightenment, the bodhi. One famous tale describes a bodhisattva as a monkey ruler who transforms his own body into a living bridge, allowing his monkey followers to escape from soldiers attacking them. Another story tells of a royal prince who encounters a starving tiger on the verge of death, leaving behind 5 helpless baby cubs who would also perish. The compassionate prince gives up his own life to nourish the tiger, and she can survive to take care of her young ones. Each one of these narratives shows the bodhisattva developing these essential qualities and the abilities that he would eventually need to reach complete enlightenment, to reach nirvana. And these crucial characteristics include the ability to remain calm under pressure and strong empathy in caring for others, clear understanding of reality, focused meditation, wisdom, and most critically, the willingness to give freely to those around them. Following countless millions of existences spent slowly building these positive traits and earning beneficial karma, the bodhisattva is eventually born into what Buddhist tradition considers his final human form, Siddhartha. So this concept of karma, I'm sure you've heard people talk about it, but where does it actually come from? Basically, in early Buddhism, karma, well, originally it was written in a language known as Pali, and they said kama, but they basically refer to the same thing, just an action or a deed that has a consequence. And these intentional actions performed through the body, mind, or speech have lasting effects that basically shape, present and future experiences. And the Buddha emphasized that it is intention that actually creates karma, not merely the outward ritual or behavior. So karma operates as a natural law of cause and effect. Wholesome actions motivated by generosity or compassion or wisdom lead to favorable conditions and happiness, while unwholesome actions rooted in greed or hatred and ignorance basically lead to more suffering. And this influence extends beyond a single lifetime, carrying over through the process of rebirth. Now, in Buddhist tradition, the Buddha himself is said to have accumulated vast stores of wholesome karma over countless past lives, preparing the conditions for his final birth as Siddhartha Gautama. Early texts portray him as a bodhisattva in previous lives, gradually cultivating the perfections that would then culminate in his actual enlightenment. Now, the Jataka, what I mentioned before, basically are collections of hundreds of stories that depict the Buddha's past lives as bodhisattva. Preserved in the Pali Canon, this original sort of, Indo-Aryan language that we discussed earlier, and many other, Buddhist traditions later on, they basically come together to illustrate how the future Buddha cultivated virtues such as, generosity and compassion across all of these rebirths. They appear in ancient Indian art all over the subcontinent and continue to be retold in Sri Lanka and Myanmar and Tibet, China, and Japan. And these tales often emphasize gradual spiritual progress, showing that enlightenment is reached through this consistent practice rather than just sudden divine intervention from beyond. In Buddhist folklore, there's a story about the Buddha in a past life, and the Buddha wasn't a man, but rather living life as a rabbit. And one day he met a starving traveler, and having nothing to give this starving traveler, he offered his own body as food by leaping into a fire, basically roasting himself so that this traveler could actually eat something. And the gods were so moved by his generosity that they saved him a place and placed his image on the moon as a reminder of this selfless act. This is why in many Asian cultures, people see a rabbit on the moon. Whereas in America, we'd be like, oh yeah, the man on the moon, and they see a face on the moon. In many Asian cultures, they see a rabbit on the moon, and the moon is associated with the rabbit, and it all comes from this Buddhist tale of compassion. In the earliest Buddhist text, the term bodhisattva referred specifically to Siddhartha Gautama in his past lives before becoming the Buddha that we know today. And the Theravada tradition preserves this sense, teaching that only Buddhas follow the long bodhisattva path, while ordinary practitioners pursue the goal of becoming arahant. Basically, this is someone who attains liberation in this lifetime. Centuries later, the rise of Mahayana Buddhism, around like the 1st century BC, 1st century AD roughly, basically transformed this concept. So the bodhisattva ideal expanded to include all practitioners who vow to postpone final enlightenment until all beings can be freed from this earthly suffering. And this became central to Mahayana spirituality, which there have been many sort of religious figures and teachers throughout generations who have kind of embodied this compassion and this wisdom. So, thus far, we've been examining the spiritual stories and a lot of the folklore that Buddhists will tell about their founder and the life that he lived. But now let's kind of shift to a different question. What can we actually prove about the Buddha as a real person who lived in history? Now, historical evidence tells us he came into the world in southern Nepal at a location known as Lumbini, which is today near the border between Nepal and India. And this means he grew up surrounded by many different religious beliefs and many different practices, especially those connected to Vedic Brahmanism. The term Siddhartha translates to he who accomplishes his goal, while Gautama represents the family which he belonged to. His ethnic community was called the Shakyas, which explains why some people refer to him as Shakyamuni Buddha. Many experts believe he lived sometime around the 5th century BC. Now, I want to stress the word probably here because researchers continue to argue about the actual facts surrounding Buddha's existence. The challenge here really lies in the fact that there are very few written records that just survive from that time period in general. And archaeologists have discovered some physical evidence, but many of it is limited to really what we're looking for in, modern day. However, we do possess Buddhist writings about the Buddha's experiences. The oldest collection is known as the Pali Canon, which claims to preserve the actual words the Buddha spoke while he was alive. And according to tradition, his students memorized these teachings after his death and eventually wrote them down sometime around the 1st century BC, which means hundreds of years passed after the Buddha's lifetime. So despite this long gap, experts believe that much of this material traces back to at least the 3rd century BC. What information do these ancient texts provide about the Buddha's life? Surprisingly, not a ton. Remarkably, these early writings contain only the most general mentions of his background and never really present a complete account of his childhood or his youth, which for most ancient texts, they don't really describe childhood. Childhood is kind of like a modern concept that kind of came about with capitalism, but that's a topic for a different episode. So, for instance, a text called The Noble Search. Researchers consider this one of the earliest personal accounts of the Buddha's experiences, possibly written as early as the 4th century, placing it within the first few hundred years following Buddha's death. In this work, the Buddha describes his past using these words. Later, while still young, a black-haired young man endowed with the blessings of youth, in the prime of life, though my mother and father wished otherwise and wept with tearful faces. I shaved off hair and beard, put on the yellow robe, and went forth from the home life into homelessness. Essentially, this passage tells us that during his youth, the Buddha abandoned his regular family life to become a religious wanderer who wore simple robes and survived just by asking for food from, random people, rather than living the conventional lifestyle. I mean, notice even in the text how straightforward and basic this account is. Yet future generations of Buddhists transform these simple early records into much more detailed and dramatic versions of the Buddha's life story that develop into more complex character. The version I'll share with you represents probably the most widely known telling, but it comes from the 5th century AD, more than 800 years after the Buddha's death. This represents just one example among many that describe the Buddha's life with extensive detail. Now, in full disclosure of trying to be as accurate as possible, we should recognize that these later versions appeared quite late and include many elements that the actual historical Buddha maybe never taught. But nonetheless, these narratives hold great significance because they represent these stories that later Buddhist communities would use to actually make sense of their founder and his teachings. Now, in trying to study the Buddha from a historical perspective, there are going to be some challenges, right? There's no photos or video recording or newspapers. In the Buddha's time, writing was not commonly used for religious teaching. Instead, knowledge was preserved through oral transmission. And most people couldn't read or write, and so stories were passed down through memorization and just basically reciting them to each other. And this oral tradition allows teaching to survive for centuries, but it also means historians kind of have to evaluate more carefully how much of what we have today reflects the Buddha's actual words. Another challenge is the fragility of any ancient writing materials like, palm leaves or anything like, papyrus, right? Because these things quickly decay and many texts were lost due to war and fire and just falling apart over time. So as a result, scholars today are working with fragmentary evidence, basically piecing together history from what has survived. And although few written records survive from the time, there are some archaeological discoveries that help us understand the world in which he lived. So excavations in Lumbini, this is in modern Nepal, traditionally regarded where the Buddha was born and kind of where he was brought up. They have discovered ancient shrines dating to around the 6th century BC, and this shows that the site has been revered for over 2 millennia. And archaeologists working in northern India and Nepal have basically uncovered evidence of these thriving cities and trade networks and political states during Buddha's time, such as coins and pottery and iron and early urban structures that show a society that was basically shifting from small tribal groups to an actual large, complicated state. Now, this broader context helps explain why new religious ideas were emerging, right? In a time of social and economic transformation, The Buddha's teachings addressed fundamental questions about human suffering and what it actually means to live meaningfully in this rapidly changing world. So based on these earlier religious narratives about the Buddha, the future enlightened teacher entered the world as royalty. Miraculous omens announced his arrival before his birth. His mother experienced a dream where a white elephant approached and entered her body, and soon afterwards she discovered that she was expecting a child. At the moment of his birth, his very first act was to walk 7 steps towards the north and declare, "I am chief of the world." This traditional tale describes Siddhartha as someone who lived a completely protected existence, never really encountering any form of hardship or misery, and he took a princess basically as his bride, became the father to a son, and enjoyed what appeared to basically be just, a perfectly content existence. However, one day, divine beings inspired Siddhartha with curiosity about the world beyond the walls of the palace. Siddhartha persuaded his chariot rider, a man named Channa, to escort him on basically an exploration outside the walls of his little castle. And during this trip, he encountered what history remembers as the forced sights. Initially, he observed an elderly person and inquired, "What's that?" Channa explained that aging affects every human being. Next, he witnessed a diseased person, and he said, "What's that?" And then his driver said, "This is what happens when people get sick, and, illness eventually comes on every person in their life." And then he came upon a corpse, and he said, "What is this?" And his driver said that death eventually claims all living things. And Siddhartha felt deeply disturbed and demanded to know, will this happen to me and to my wife and to my son and basically to every person that I know and love? And his driver confirmed that mortality awaits every being. Now, this story emphasizes that this moment really marked the very first occasion that Siddhartha learned about aging and mortality. And in that instant, Siddhartha understood